Welcome to Surface Knowledge, the only podcast that provides you with useless information for a useful reason. Never again be stuck without an interesting tidbit or fun fact in any social situation. Here's your host, Max Kurton.
Welcome back, everyone, to Surface Knowledge, the podcast that delivers just enough to impress in 30 minutes or less. Now, it's been lovely to see people engaging with the first 3 episodes that launched last week. No real shock that the surface knowledge of video games is doing so well. I'll probably have to revisit that one in the future. But if you are new to the show, welcome. Please make sure that you do follow on whatever podcasting platform you use. Give it a nice 5-star rating if you like. And you can now also follow us for clips and other fun facts on Blue Sky, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, all under the tag Surface Knowledge Pod. So before we dive into this week's episode, as always, please remember that I do my absolute best to research thoroughly, but with this being the internet, please remember always to do your own research. And if you are an expert on the subject matter or would like to know more about a specific fact or area, then just reach out to me at godtil5@gmail.com. Also remember that this is surface knowledge, meaning we won't be covering every detail. There are plenty of deep dive podcasts out there if you're looking for more. Now, in this week's episode, we are going to be gaining a surface knowledge of the North Pole. Why, you ask? Well, I'm going to tell you. I was reading a lovely murder mystery novel last week that came out at the start of the year, and it was called Death in the Arctic by Tom Hindle, where an aspiring travel writer is invited aboard a luxury airship flying to the North Pole, thinking she had bagged the opportunity of a lifetime before a murder derails everything as they're trapped floating above the most desolate place on Earth. And it really was a lovely read, and if you're a fan of those type of murder mystery books, then I highly recommend giving it a read, as it was really well paced. It had a great variety of characters, the world was nicely enriched, and when I was reading it, I found myself doing a lot of searching, and there was parts in the book where they talked about the world's most northern city, which is Longyearbyen in Norway, and then looking at the North Pole itself, and it really is something that just exists, but I personally don't give a lot of thought about, and you might not either. It is very interesting and unique in terms of this mass of water and ice that exists on our planet that really is unlike anything else. And that's why today we're going to become experts on all things the North Pole in this episode of Surface Knowledge. So let's start with the basics here, and then we're going to transition into some fun facts, some old myths, and then obviously the history of how it was explored. But the basics first. The North Pole is the northernmost point on Earth, hence the name, and it's located at 90 degrees north latitude in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, and is the point where the Earth's axis of rotation meets its surface. The Arctic is a descriptive word, and it comes from the Greek word of Arctos, which means bear. So the Arctic is the land of the bears, and Antarctica, south, is the opposite of Arctic, meaning opposite the bear or without bear. So the land without bears. I'm saying bears quite a bit here. But Arctic refers to the constellations Ursa Major, the Great Bear, and Ursa Minor, the Little Bear, which are prominent in the northern sky, hence the name. So it's named after the constellations, not the polar bears. And the North Pole is not land like its opposite counterpart of the Antarctic. It is a constantly shifting sea ice. And due to the lack of land and the shifting nature of the ice, it is difficult to establish permanent research stations at the North Pole, but there have been drifting research stations that have been used to study the region. Now, the North Pole and the surrounding Arctic Ocean are not claimed by any country and are governed by the international law of the sea. Although Russia did place a titanium flag on the seabed in 2007, staking its claim to what it believed to be almost a quarter of the Earth's oil and gas reserves underneath. Russia argued that the North Pole is merely just an extension of the Lomonosov Ridge, an underwater chain of hills that extend from the Russian mainland, and therefore it's Russian territory. But then Denmark came into the conversation and argued that the ridge is actually an extension of Greenland, and thus it is Danish territory. So even though Russia congratulated itself for this move, the rest of the world was not amused by it. And then even more than a decade on, Russia's claim to the North Pole's resources have not been recognized by the United Nations. My favorite fact about the North Pole that I discovered is that it has no time zone. As it is the most northern point on our planet, all points of longitude connect from the North Pole to the South Pole, meaning that technically the poles are in all 24 time zones simultaneously. And also, the sun rises and sets just once per year, so time of day is kind of irrelevant as well. So, if you stood atop the geographical North Pole, shivering, I might add, you would exist in kind of a temporal anomaly. And if you took a short circular walk around the metaphorical pole, you would cross every time zone in a few seconds, and in a sense, speeding time up, and even changing the date when you cross the international dateline. One recent Arctic journey kind of shows that time warping effect of exploring near the pole. The research ship RV Polarstern sailed out of the Norwegian port of Tromsø and into the Arctic Ocean in September 2019. Now, her mission was to drift with the ice and study the effects of climate change on the Arctic ice sheet. The long polar sunset lingered for weeks in October, and as the last glimmer of light disappeared, the ship's captain decided on a policy of moving the time zone back once a week for 6 consecutive weeks. Now, obviously, this was no easy task because clocks had to be precisely reset, instruments would need to be recalibrated, work shifts were adjusted, and communications reorganized for each time change. A short time after this, another ship, the icebreaker Academic Fedorov, pulled up right next to the Polarstern to deliver supplies. In that case, the vessels were actually existing in different time zones, creating this kind of bizarre time gap between two ships that were only meters apart. Now, if we look at the actual history of exploration and how this area was discovered, there is actually an interesting myth tied to the Arctic known as the land of Hyperborea. The ancient Greeks believed in a mystical people known as the Hyperboreans, who lived far beyond the north wind. Hyper means beyond, and Boreas was the name of the north wind itself. To them, this was a paradise, an untouched land of eternal spring, where people lived in bliss, free from war, hardship, or even old age. Some scholars have actually speculated that Hyperborea was more than just a myth. Historian Herodotus mentioned that the Hyperboreans lived beyond the Massigaeti and the Isodones, which were ancient tribes from Central Asia. If we take that clue a little bit further, we might place Hyperborea somewhere in Serbia, but others believe that it could have been farther north, possibly near the Arctic itself. And one of the interesting interpretations come from Greek mythology. Heracles, in one of his famous 12 labors, was sent to capture a golden antlered hind from Hyperborea, and the only deer species where females have antlers is the reindeer, which is native to Arctic and subarctic regions. Then there's the more controversial theory, one that suggests that the Arctic was once the cradle of civilization itself. In the late 19th century, Boston University's first president, William F. Warren, proposed that humanity's original homeland was at the North Pole. This idea was later picked up by Bal Gangadhar Tilak, an Indian independence activist, in his book, The Arctic Home in the Vedas. He argued that ancient Hindu scriptures hinted at an Arctic origin for Indo-European peoples. Soviet-era historians took this even further, linking the idea to Slavic and Indo-Aryan ancestry. But, of course, modern scholars generally kind of dismiss this as pseudo-history, but I do think it's kind of a fascinating example of how the Arctic has captured that human imagination as not just this desolate, icy wasteland, but as a potential birthplace of civilization itself. Now, if we go from myth to real history, the Greeks didn't just dream about the North, they actually tried to go there. Around 325 BC, a Greek explorer named Pythias set out on an incredible journey. He sailed past the Pillars of Hercules, which is the modern-day Strait of Gibraltar, and up along the coast of France, past Cornwall and around the British Isles, where he heard rumors of a mysterious land even further north, a place called Thule. Now, after 6 more days at sea, Pythias arrived at a land where the sun never fully set, and the sea looked, as he described it, curdled. And that leads us to today, where we think he was describing the Arctic ice as the curdled sea, and possibly the aurora borealis, or the sun never setting. Some believe Thule was Norway, others say it was the Shetland Islands, or even Iceland. So Pythias may have been the first Greek to cross the Arctic Circle, but his stories were met with skepticism. There were later scholars like the Roman geographer Strabo, who dismissed them as pure fantasy. Centuries later, we know Pythias was likely telling the truth. He had ventured farther north than any Greek before him, bringing back one of the earliest recorded accounts of the Arctic. Now, bringing it back to more modern day, for centuries, explorers kind of believed that the North Pole sat in an open sea, making it this tantalizing target for discovery. There were whaling ships that were already venturing into Arctic waters, and a search for a path to the pole began in earnest. One of the very first serious attempts to reach the pole came in 1827, when British naval officer William Edward Parry pushed as far north as 82 degrees 45 minutes north. It was very impressive feat for the time, but the Arctic itself, with its ice, proved too formidable for him to get through. Now, the decades that followed that saw a mix of kind of ambition and disaster. In 1871, the US Polaris expedition was led by Charles Francis Hall, and it ended a catastrophe with its own murder mystery, as Hall suddenly fell ill and died, accusing members of his crew, particularly Chief Scientist Emil Bessels, of orchestrating his murder. A naval board of inquiry investigated Hall's death, but no charges were ever laid. However, an exhumation of his body in 1968 revealed that he had ingested a large quantity of arsenic in the last 2 weeks of his life. I think if this episode does well, we're definitely going to do one on the Polaris expedition because it's a fascinating story. Back to this episode, though. The British Arctic expedition fared slightly better in 1876. It set a new record of 83 degrees 20 minutes 26 seconds north before it had to turn back. But the dangers of Arctic travel were relentless. Just a few years later, in 1881, US Navy officer George W. DeLong and most of his crew perished after their ship, the USS Jeannette, was crushed by ice. In 1895, Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen attempted a radical approach. After deliberately freezing his ship, the Fram, into the ice, he and Hilmar Johansen set out on skis towards the poles, and they reached 86 degrees 14 minutes north, which was farther north than anyone before them, but they ultimately did have to turn back. Now, their journey was a breakthrough in Arctic travel, proving that sleds and skis were way more reliable than ships. A few years later, in 1897, Swedish engineer Solomon August André attempted to reach the pole by hydrogen balloon. It was a very bold but unfortunately ill-fated plan, as his balloon crashed just days into the journey, and he and his companions perished months later on a remote Arctic island. But their remains weren't discovered until 1930. Meanwhile, Italian explorer Luigi Amadeo Duke of the Abruzzi sent Captain Umberto Cagni on a daring over-ice expedition in 1900. Cagni reached 86 degrees 34 minutes north, breaking Nansen's record, but he barely made it back to the camp alive. So the turn of the century saw a fierce race to the pole, but it was shrouded in controversy. In 1908, American explorer Frederick Cook claimed that he had reached the North Pole, but he provided no solid proof, and the claim was largely dismissed. But just a year later, in 1909, Robert Peary announced that he, alongside his assistant, Matthew Henson, and 4 Inuit men, had reached the pole on April 6th. Peary's claim was widely accepted at the time, but skeptics pointed out inconsistencies in his navigational records. His reported speed in the final days of travel seemed almost impossible, and his own assistant Henson recalled taking long detours over difficult ice ridges. Decades later, there was a British explorer called Wally Herbert, and he re-examined Peary's records and concluded that Peary had likely fallen short. However, in 2005, another British adventurer called Tom Avery recreated Peary's journey using the same sleds and dog teams. Not the same dogs, but you know what I mean. He reached the pole in a similar time frame, suggesting that Peary's feat might have been possible, but Avery's fastest 5-day march still fell far short of Peary's most ambitious claims. By the 1920s, aviation had offered a new way to conquer the Arctic. In 1926, US naval officer Richard E. Byrd and pilot Floyd Bennett claimed to have flown over the North Pole. However, later analysis of Byrd's diaries suggests that he may have turned back early due to mechanical issues. That same year, there was a more definitive success when Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen and Italian aviator Umberto Nobile flew over the pole in an airship, like from the book I was reading, called the Norge. Unlike Bird, they left no doubt they had reached their goal. Now, switching gears from a climate perspective, I don't think it's going to shock anyone when I say that the North Pole is characterized by extreme cold, with temperatures that fluctuate significantly over time and across seasons. Arctic sea ice expands in the fall and winter, where it reaches its maximum extent in early March, and then it shrinks again in the spring and summer, reaching its minimum extent in September. It is currently warming at a rate much faster than the global average. NASA data shows that the Arctic sea ice, which is at its minimum extent in September, is shrinking at a rate of 12.2% per decade. So the Arctic is warming at a rate that is nearly 4 times faster than the global average, and this phenomenon is known as Arctic amplification. The Greenland ice sheet, which is a major source of land ice in the Arctic, is also losing ice, which is contributing to sea level rise and disrupting local climates and ecosystems, such as when the Arctic warms, the number and frequency of wildfires are increasing, which obviously leads to negative impacts on ecosystems, population, and the climate in general. If we take a historical perspective, about 55 million years ago, parts of the Arctic may have supported subtropical ecosystems, with Arctic sea surface temperatures rising to around 23 degrees Celsius or 73 degrees Fahrenheit, and there were finds of alligator ancestors and palm trees. The Arctic has experienced cycles of glacial expansion and retreat during the Quaternary Ice Age, with large changes in sea levels and ice cover. According to the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC, if you will, the global mean temperature has increased by 0.6 to 0.9 degrees Celsius, or 1.1 to 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit for our American friends, over the last century, with the Arctic warming at a faster rate. On June 20th, 2020, temperatures reached a scorching 37 degrees Celsius or 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit in a Serbian town, which the United Nations confirmed as the highest temperature ever recorded in the Arctic. Now let's do a couple of last-minute facts and tidbits before we wrap up this week's show. Now, since 2003, the North Pole has hosted an annual marathon in April that attracts some of the world's most extreme athletes. Those who participate must find inventive ways of preparing for the rugged conditions. Some athletes go as far as to train in industrial freezers to help simulate the sub-zero temperatures. The race itself is run on small 4.22 kilometer or 2.62 mile loops, about 10 times over hard snow or frozen ice. The first unofficial North Pole Marathon was a solo run by a gentleman by the name of Richard Donovan on the 5th of April 2002. He did it in a time of 3 hours, 48 minutes, and 12 seconds. Richard had won the first South Pole Marathon 10 weeks previously and became the first marathoner at both poles by completing the North Pole Marathon. In 1987, Tokyo motorcycle shop owner and racer Shinji Kazama left Canada's Ward Hunt Island bound for the North Pole on his Yamaha TW200. Kazama and the 5 members of his support team traveled 1,250 miles over sea ice in conditions so extreme that at times the motorcycle could only travel 30 feet per hour. It took him 44 days to reach the destination. 5 years later, in 1992, Kazama completed the same feat at the South Pole, becoming the first and only person to have reached both poles by motorcycle. The earliest known map of the North Pole was reproduced in 1606, but the original was drawn in 1569 by a Flemish cartographer named Gerardus Mercator. Now, you might recognize his name from the Mercator projection. That's the map that straightens the curved latitudinal and longitudinal lines of a globe so that they fit on a flat two-dimensional map. If you ever seen a map where Greenland looks as big as Africa, well, you can thank Mercator for that. But the funny thing about this particular map of the North Pole is that it is almost entirely made up. As I explained, it wasn't until the 1800s when all of this exploration was really happening. In the early 16th century, no one had actually been to the North Pole, so Mercator based his design on second-hand accounts from heavily exaggerated travel journals. As a result, his version of the North Pole looks nothing like the real thing. In his map, the North Pole is divided into 4 distinct landmasses that are separated by a channel of water that all flow into this massive whirlpool at the center. And right in the middle of that whirlpool is a giant magnetic rock. According to Mercator, one of these 4 islands was home to a mysterious race of 4-foot-tall pygmies, which, if you think about it, you could maybe argue was the original home of Santa's elves. And finally, speaking of Santa, there's no way we can do an episode on the North Pole and not mention the jolly old fella himself. So, St. Nicholas, the 4th century religious figure from whom the myth of Santa Claus is derived, came from Myra, a Roman town in what is now Turkey. But in the mid-1800s, cartoonist Thomas Nast began depicting the saintly character as we know him today, fat, jolly, and with a sack of toys. Because a flurry of American and European expeditions to the Arctic captured the world's imagination at the time, Nast selected the fabled location for Santa's permanent home. So there we go. I think without a shadow of a doubt, that covers all of the surface knowledge that you're ever going to need on the North Pole. And I had a lot of fun researching this one, and I really do hope you enjoyed listening to it. And if you did, then please share the knowledge and obviously the episode link far and wide, and also subscribing and rating on your favorite podcasting app. And also remember, as I mentioned at the top of the show, you can follow us for clips and further facts on Blue Sky, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, all under the tag Surface Knowledge Pod. I'm going to be back right here next week. I hope you are too, because we're going to gain a surface knowledge of serial killers for all you morbid podcast lovers. See you then, lovelies.
You've been listening to the Surface Knowledge Podcast, part of the GT5 Network. Be sure to subscribe and rate on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. We'll see you back here soon for another episode. Until next time, stay curious.